So thank you everybody for joining us today. We are on kind of, I guess, week three, started week three here for the Embodied series with Eternal Remedy. So today we are speaking to Shivani. I get to be so lucky to have these super talented women every Saturday morning, so I'm really liking this.
Mm-hmm.
So Shivani, I'll turn it over to you. Tell us, welcome yourself. Welcome and tell us who you are.
Sure. I'm Shivani Persad. I was born in Trinidad. I moved to Canada when I was about 5 years old and went to McMaster with Nadia. I did 2 degrees, one in political science and the other in French. And naturally, I do nothing that has to do with those degrees. I model full time. I just started like freelance journalism on the side. And I also do a lot of labor activism with the Model Alliance in New York. We're like really the only regulatory body for labor protections for models. On the side of that, I have a storytelling platform called Live Shiv Media, where our whole thing is just like telling the stories that aren't being told. Like I've been in media for the last 10 years and I still feel like we're telling the same stories over and over again. And they tend to not be stories that have to do with people of color. And they tend to not really be, I would say, groundbreaking a lot of the time. So I just wanted to tell the stories that I wasn't hearing. And so that's why I started Live Shiv Media. And those are kind of like I would say like my four streams of interest in things that I do.
Yeah, that's amazing, and it's such an amazing thing to hear that there's an amazing, and we're going to talk about community today, but an amazing community of people who really just want to advocate for others. So I think that takes us nicely into our topic. This week we're focusing on community. We've had some chats about community from a few different perspectives. We've spoken with some DJs, some artists, some people in and around the music community. So I'm really looking forward to getting your take from two communities that are new to our conversation. So I guess to start things off, Shivani, what does community mean to you?
I think, you really don't have much else if you don't have community. I'm a very like community oriented person, I guess. I don't do super well on my own. I think as I get older, I'm sort of more interested in spending time with myself, but I love all the different communities that I have. And that's one of the reasons I love New York so much is there's so many different communities and it's so easy to sort of like get involved with something. And I think like, we're better together really. And in every initiative that I've ever taken a part of, for example, with the Model Alliance, there's no way for us to sort of deal with like the adversity that we deal with unless we do it together. And so for me, community really is about not just relating to other people, but I think it's one of the only ways we can move forward.
Yeah, that's absolutely beautiful. And we talk a lot lately, and we have been talking a lot lately about what community means to us now that some of these communities that a lot of us are part of have been brought to the light and been spoken a lot about. And the role of an advocate in a community is unmatched. I think the kind of work that you're doing, speaking for the people who don't have a voice and don't see their story, is very, very powerful work. So I'm kind of thinking about things like how we shape a community. So I guess my first question, and stay with me here, I have an idea of where to go, but what did you think community was when you were younger? And what did you learn, I guess, as you've grown to kind of change your idea of community?
Yeah, I mean, so it was interesting because when I moved here from Trinidad, my parents always make the joke that like my accent changed on the plane. Like I started having a Canadian accent right away on the plane. I became very Canadian, but at home I was very Caribbean. And I mean, I'm sure Mark can like speak to this, but the Caribbean culture is a really community-based culture. We do a lot of things together, whether that's like a huge family or, multiple families getting together. And so I've always had that sense of community, but it was hard for me to feel like I fit in a lot of times because I didn't look like everybody else for the most part. And also my skin is quite dark. And in my family, especially in my mom's side of the family, everybody's skin is quite light. So I was sort of always this like weird one out, and people like said it out loud. They would straight up be like, oh, you look like your dad's family. Like you're really dark, things like that. And like, it's really hard to feel like you belong to a community when that's, the way that they make you feel. And so I had it growing up for sure, but I always kind of felt like the odd one out a lot of the time. Also, I was like always a rebel. I kind of always have done whatever the hell I wanted to do. And that's not really, like kosher or whatever, in like an Indo-Caribbean family. So it was hard for me to fit in that sense as well. So I think for me, when it became about being a model, finally I felt like I was being seen. I never saw anybody that looked like me growing up in media. And so I kind of felt like I was being seen. I sort of felt like I had more of a community of all these amazing men and women who were doing the same job as me, that like less than 1% of the world does our job. And so I was able to build community in that way. And I think in some ways it's like I started Live Shiv Media to sort of like try to do that for other people, because it's really difficult to grow up that way, you know, and you are like longing for this sense of belonging, but then solely because of like the way that you look, you sort of, it doesn't really matter what you say, like you just don't belong, you know? So I guess it kind of changed in that way, that I sort of started to create the community for myself in the end.
Yeah. And maybe you can tell us a bit about what are some of the communities that you identify with?
So definitely models, I would say first and foremost, just because it's such a small community. And models are, I mean, really incredible. Like that's why I had started my podcast so many years ago, because we didn't have a community really in New York. In my experience, there have always been these sort of informal communities, but I started my podcast, More Than Model Radio, because I really wanted to sort of show and demonstrate to people that models are about a lot more than what we look like. And people just kept asking us the same questions in interviews, right? Like, or castings, like, who's your favorite designer? What's your style? Whatever. And I was like, I don't know, man. Like, I'm not a model for this. Like, I'm just a model because I want representation, and I'm like super political and really like social justice-y, and like nobody ever asked me about that stuff. So I thought, I'm just going to ask the questions myself. And I know tons of women and men that are incredible. Nobody ever asked them anything other than like, you know, what workout do you do? So I started it myself, and that was a really great way for us, like I was sort of mentioning before we started recording, like to create community, because we did huge events in New York and Chicago and a few different places. And it was a good way to start community that way. So definitely models, definitely Indo-Caribbeans. Again, that's like quite a small population as well, you know, all things considered. Definitely smaller than like the larger Indian community. As I get older, I feel like I identify with that community less and less, and more with being an Indo-Caribbean, like specifically like Trinidadian person. And also, let me think, you know, now it's very interesting. Now that I'm getting into freelance writing, I'm learning that is a whole other community I had no idea about. And they're kind of in the same boat as us as models. Like, unless you're a staff writer, you can't really unionize. So you don't have a community there. And I found it's really built on Twitter. Like that freelance writer community is really built on Twitter, and people are really there for each other. I mean, maybe I'm just really lucky, but I've had so much help, and I've been meeting a lot of other women of color writers that have a community as well. And so I would say for the most part, those three are the ones that I resonate with the most.
Yeah. And you know, it's interesting that you speak what you mentioned about the writing community and how it shows up on Twitter. We actually here for Turn Around Embody, we do speak to quite a few people in a number of different creative fields. Actually, I noticed I've turned this video off, but I was just going to turn it over. I guess, Mark, if you want to maybe one of the two of you lovely lads, your take on what you've learned and about community when it comes to freelance writers from some different perspectives.
Mark? I'll speak. First of all, thank you for sharing space with us. This has been good so far. I've already learned, and you're just having me reflect, Shivani, on the sort of construct that being a model suggests. It's almost like anti-intellectual construct, and so I really appreciate you doing the work to divorce those sort of stereotypes, because in some way, in some degree, we do that similarly in our space, where we marry the literary work with the artistic work, because we believe the multimodal approach is the most effective. And so carrying on from that and thinking about the literary community, it's often apprehensive, it's often isolated and lonely, it's often confused and non-commercial, and it's this interesting dichotomy I think you experience, where people want to be pure and true to their word and their art and their lived experience, and thinking about how they can manage their brand and expand their own portfolio and continue to do that as work. You know, that obviously that experience isn't unique for literature. It's just like a conundrum in the art space in general. Mm-hmm. But what I think is interesting about literature is that people are protective of their words. You know, it's probably the closest gateway window into who you actually are underneath your surface appearances. And so I think what we have to do a lot of the times is a lot of trust building exercises to let our contributors know that we're going to protect their words in a way that represents them in a good light, while they can think about how they manage their brand expansion and the commerciality of it. So those are the things that came to mind for me. I don't know if you'd add anything to that, Mark.
Mark, who is a beautiful writer also, just wanted to make sure I plug him there.
Oh, thank you. Again, Shivani, thank you for being here, and thank you for breaking down things in the lovely way in which you've been doing it. In terms of community, as it relates to writing, one of the things that I find interesting is that everybody's always, as a writer, everybody's always struggling to, you know, have their stories heard. And I have the same struggle too. And I think I really connect with that when it comes on to other writers. You know, it's really hard to like put something out there that represents you well, and to get paid for it. And I don't know. I think it is a beautiful struggle, you know, struggling uphill against the grain just to, you know, make something that is pure. And I think a lot of freelancers or freelance writers go through that. And I think there's something that is beautiful to be shared in that struggle. So that's where I find my connection with the writing community.
Mm-hmm. I would also say I've been really blessed that in a weird way, modeling and writing have gone together in the sense that I have been in a lot of publications. Like my face has been in a lot of publications. So now I'm having to sometimes lean on that community to sort of pitch to those people to now have my writing be in those same publications. And I think like that's a weird way in which the two communities kind of go together. And I've been able to sort of go from one community to another and have that support be there. For example, I'm trying to think of one of the ones, like I just did a piece for Teen Vogue about my friend Alok Menon and a book that they put out about being a gender nonconforming person. And I've been in Teen Vogue before, like featured as an activist for models and things like that, but I had no connection to them. And I reached out to Alok, who is a friend, and I said, you know, can I write about your book? And they were like, sure, let me connect you with this person from Teen Vogue. And I think, you know, as a new writer, that probably wouldn't happen. You don't just start writing for Teen Vogue, but I'm just very lucky that I had that community. I've met those people. I've been in there before. And now I can say that I've been published in Teen Vogue, which is really amazing. And I'm so lucky to have that. But it's been a really interesting thing for me to see sort of like sometimes how communities can lean on each other as well.
Yeah, and I think something that we've even been talking about, like on the topic of monetization and opportunities, is like using your network in a way that's going to benefit you, you know, and to make things that you're ultimately very passionate about your career path, because that I think that's really truly the recipe to a happy adult is to love genuinely what you do. And I think you seem like you are, you know, you've got that genuine passion. So it's definitely beautiful to see. I'll plug you really quick. Google Shivani's name if you want to see beautiful writing as well as photographs. Some of the things she does is amazing. So I just want to plug you there also. So, and we talked about, you know, how being a model kind of showed up for you along your path in writing. I want to touch on another community and how it's impacted you. So, you know, the Indo-Caribbean background that you've got, how has that shown up in the work that you do on both sides, on the modeling side and on the writing side?
Well, yeah, as a model, for sure. I mean, there are some Indian models. There's definitely not a lot of Indo-Caribbean models. I think I know one other girl who's actually also from Trinidad, and actually our families know each other. So like, that's how small it is. And so it's very small there. And I think, you know, it's like this idea of intersection. It's complicated sometimes for people to understand, like, when I'm in a casting and I say, you know, I'm from Trinidad, people are like, oh, I would have thought you were Indian. And I'm like, we are Indian, but I am Indo-Caribbean. And I very much would never go to someone and say, I'm Indian. Like, no, I'm Caribbean. Like, I'm from Trinidad. That's my country. That's where I'm from. We haven't been to India in the last 5 generations, you know? So that intersection is really important for me. And it's been difficult to sort of like articulate that sometimes, because especially when I'm in castings and things like that, they kind of want to put you in a box right away. And like, I get it. If you look at me, a lot of times you would think Indian. That's fine. I understand the industry is about images, but at the same time, I can't necessarily say that I super relate to that community. You know, I don't speak any of the languages that they speak. I eat very different food. I listen to very different music. Their religion is maybe the only thing that is in common, and I'm not a very religious person. So, you know, when people ask me sometimes if I'm super happy that there's lots of Indian models like coming up now, because there are, and I've modeled in India as well, and it was a very interesting experience. You know, I'm like, yeah, I am really happy, but I also want to see Indo-Caribbean models. I want to see more girls from Trinidad. I want to see more girls or more guys, whoever, from, you know, Guyana and all these other places. That's important to me too, not just because there's Indian models that I'm like super happy, you know, because that's not necessarily my community first, I would think. I don't know if that's the right way to word that, but I think you know what I mean. Yeah. And then also, like, just to touch on to that, like when I was modeling in India, like, you know, they like gave me an identity crisis. Like, I was like, nobody thought I was Indian. They were confused as to like why my name was Shivani and why I didn't speak Hindi. And like that my fiance was, at that time, my fiance was Gujarati. Like, they were just very confused. And I was like, you know, it doesn't make me any less Indian than you. I just have this other beautiful part of me because I'm from a Caribbean island. But I was treated like very less Indian, you know? And so that kind of gave me this sense of like, do I feel attached to this community or am I not a part of it, you know? And I kind of had to sort of suss that out a little bit. And it was very difficult for me. So that's kind of how it's shown up for me there as a model. As a writer, like, I've been pitching a lot of pieces lately, and I'm sure you've seen on my Instagram, like the guidebook we've been putting out, sort of trying to fight anti-Blackness in our community. And I've been pitching a lot of pieces like that as well, because my perspective is very much, you know, influenced by the fact that I am Indo-Caribbean and Canadian. So I have and I live in the US. So I have like all these different perspectives from all these different communities all the time. So I always try to give a really good, well-rounded like view of things. And for the guidebook that we put out, it was really about us as a community taking onus. Like, I was like, look, I'm done with these like guidebooks that are so simple. Like, we need to be like, you know what? Our community is anti-Black, period. Let's just admit it. And let's just try to work through all these ridiculous stereotypes and all these crazy like things that we hear that are super racist. Let's just explain to people why those are wrong and it doesn't make sense, and that this is an opportunity for us as Indo-Caribbeans to support the Black community, whether they're Afro-Caribbeans or whether they're Caribbeans at all. That doesn't matter. The point is, like, there are Black people in our country. We grow up with these people, you know? Why are we not being more supportive of them in this time when we're going through a revolution? You know, so that's really what it was about for me, in terms of like just realizing that, because, you know, I feel like a lot of people thought that we were being really hard on the Indo-Caribbean community. Like, we were sort of, you know, just calling it out a lot. And I was like, you know what? I don't really care. Like, we need to call it out. And you have to know what your faults are as a community as well. And so writing that guidebook and having that sort of influence my perspective on many other things, I guess is sort of the way that I've been having it influence my writing as well.
I'm glad you brought up the guidebook, because to me that's something very, you know, an actionable item that we can do to shape the community in a way that's really going to ultimately benefit, you know, the masses. And I think showing up in that way was very smart. I'm thinking about the Toronto community, and I know you've had experience in a lot of different places. What would you prescribe to the Toronto community to make a change, and how can we influence some change in how we treat each other here in Toronto?
I mean, I don't know, maybe I have quite radical views. I think that we need to work on respecting each other's communities first, and then we can work on sort of like how we are able to work together, because I find it, for example, like, you know, if I have a brown guy friend that like says the N-word, I'm like, no, that is not your word. Please stop. Like, I can't stand that. And I think that's the kind of thing where the lines become very blurred in Toronto, right? Because we are so close and we grow up in proximity to so many other people. But I think people really need to understand that, like, that doesn't mean that culture is your culture. Like, that doesn't mean that you're allowed to like be a culture vulture or like steal from people, you know? And I know like cultural appropriation isn't a big deal to a lot of people, but it's a big deal to me because I see that as A, being disrespectful, and then B, it's like a form of covert racism to me, because if you think that you can do that and it's all like one love and blah, 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 then you don't understand the situation. I think you're very ignorant, because it's not all one love, because we're not all treated the same. And now you can see that we're not all treated the same, because brown people aren't disproportionately targeted by police, are we? No, we're not. So far be it from me to try to steal something from a Black culture. That's not fair. Like, you know, so I think in Toronto, and I mean, like it happens all the time. It's like sickening the amount that it happens in Toronto. And the excuse is like, well, I grew up in Scarborough, so. I'm like, no, like community is intersectional and we have to look at it that way. And maybe one day we will all be looked at the same. And I would love that. But until we get there, you know, we cannot wear Native American or Indigenous headdresses to music festivals. Mm-hmm. We just can't, like, you know, especially given the way in Canada, like the way that we treat the Indigenous community, we can't do that. So I think it's about like figuring out those intersectionalities, having the conversations, respecting each other first, and really listening, right? Like there's a lot of Canadian celebrities out there doing problematic stuff. And then when they get called out about it, they don't talk about it. They don't want to engage in that conversation. And that's a real problem. You have to like be able to call yourself out a little bit. So for me, that's what I would like to see for our community in Toronto. Let's just like dive into those intersections a little bit more and respect different cultures before we try to like act like we can own them.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. And as much as we say it's how we start in Toronto, it's actually really how we start globally. It's how we start anywhere. It's
yeah.
The foundation, it's the basis. Because I can move on and say, is that how you feel about New York? Well, of course, that's how we feel about everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, it makes total sense. So yeah, I guess Steph, I know you had some thoughts there about community and kind of some of the topics we talked about earlier.
Yeah, so I just want to quickly go back to some of the stuff you're saying, Shivani, around intersectionality, because I think that is a profound point, a timely point, and something even in our space here that we try to create, we simply don't have enough sophistication around. And so one of the things that came to mind as you were speaking was the intersections that you hold have served as a sort of superpower to empower your thinking, your writing, and your presence in the community and the community at large. But ironically, one of the things we've spoken about in a previous conversation is that if we are looking to resolve sort of the ignorance and the problems with Blackness and brownness and stuff, we almost lose a tool or something that we can leverage to help us write, help us engage meaningfully, help us to empower voices. So there's this strange, almost dark irony with like the things that have inhibited me in life or served as obstacles, I may no longer have as tools. So do you think there might be a bit of an element there of us clinging on to them because they are, again, superpowers of us in a certain way? Or do you think we still need to push forward the work to make sure that we bring those voices even after they come to some resolution?
You know, I think as people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, I think we are going to constantly have to push the work. Really, I think, you know, we're talking about, obviously from like a Black American perspective, we're talking about 400 years of like erased culture, you know, we're not going to fix it anytime soon. I'm happy to see what's happening, but I just think you know, that's why, like, for example, for me, when I saw everything happening, I was like, okay, I want to center Black voices and amplify Black voices as much as possible. But also, what can I do within my own community to fix this? Because I know there's anti-Blackness in my community. And where do we fit in terms of like what we need to change? And so I knew that the work that we had to do was to create this guidebook to be like, look, save this. We're going to create a PDF out of it, whatever we can do to make it as accessible and digestible as possible, because the community isn't going to do it on their own. And if I have to do the work, fine. You know, if I have to push that, fine. If this helps somebody understand, like, oh, hey, I actually have heard my mom say that, and it actually is problematic. You know, I really think we're going to have to continue to push the work forward. I will say, I'm sure you guys are all seeing how all of these sort of like racist editors and editors-in-chiefs and stuff are, you know, having to step down now. You know, Nadia, I'm sure you're paying attention to what's happening in Toronto with Jessica Mulrooney and all these kind of things. And I got to say, like, we love to see it. Like, I need it to happen more, because it's like enough of silencing like our voices, and especially Black voices, like throughout this whole thing. And I'm sure, like Mark was saying as well, it comes down to sometimes getting paid. And why are we getting paid less than everyone else to do the same job, you know? So to me, all of this is connected, and to deny that sort of connection is really looking at it the wrong way. For example, when this kind of stuff started happening, I posted a tweet on my Instagram that I had tweeted saying, you know, I find it sort of interesting that a lot of people that appropriate Black culture are all of a sudden like Black Lives Matter. And a lot of my friends understood, but I also got a lot of comments of people being like, you know, why would you bring up cultural appropriation when we're talking about police brutality? Like, we want support no matter where it comes from. And I was like, yeah, but these things are all connected. Like, you have to realize how cultural appropriation a lot of times can lead to police brutality, because it's a form of covert racism, you know? So I kind of went on a tangent there, but I really do believe that we're going to need to continue pushing the work. If I answered your question correctly.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, you did. And this sentiment really resonates. I think one of the things I've been coming to terms with this week, especially, is just this fetishizing of Blackness. Mm-hmm. And it always appears as benevolence. It's like, we want to help you, but it's really what sits underneath this is this like condescending thing of like, we just want to have our hands around Blackness. We want to help shape and mold it. We want to bring it forward. We want to adopt what we want from it. And that, to me, I think is a harder bit of work, because it isn't just overt racism. It's not just like, it's not a foot in someone's neck. And so to me, I think that's where the conversation needs to progress. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Like, how do we get into those nuances? Because it's not so much harmful language. It's not so much obvious behavior. It's like little like mindset shifts, that we need to focus on.
Yeah, I think it's about us just having those conversations and figuring out what those nuances are and calling them out. That's why, you know, a lot of people have issues with the way that we chose to do the guidebook, because we just straight up called it out, and we put these problematic statements out there. But I think that's what needs to be done at this point. Like, enough is really enough. And you know, for me, I really started noticing it when I dated a Black guy for 5 years, and he was also Muslim. And so, you know, there was a lot of different intersectionalities going on there, and a lot of people in my family were not happy about it. And so that, for me, was my sort of journey into figuring out like what this anti-Blackness is, and doing a lot of research and figuring it out. And it is on the individual. Like, we really do have to call out our own implicit bias and that kind of stuff. I think it's about having the conversation, but I think it's also about, you know, again, I just can't stand it when like people call out these celebrities and things for doing these things, and they just don't bring it up, and they just never engage in conversation. And unfortunately, they have the reach that they have. And if they did do that, it would be really powerful. But also, I'm noticing the difference between people, like I would say 5 years ago, maybe calling people out, and people calling them out now. And the numbers are, it's like exponential, the difference. So that makes me really happy. And I think it's because people were reading comments and like commentary on people calling celebrities out for this sort of stuff in the past. And now they're realizing that it is a huge problem, and now they're doing the calling out as well. And I think it's about just having the uncomfortable conversations. It's going to be uncomfortable. There are going to be arguments. It's not going to be, you know, it might be aggressive at some points, but we just need to do the work. And I think it's about removing the pride, you know, just removing the ego of like, I didn't know, or like this white guilt, whatever, just being like, okay, what can we do? You know? And like you said, it's not about us trying to shape. That's why I was like, for us, my perspective was, what can we do as Indo-Caribbean? Not like, how do I project this onto the Black community, you know? So that's kind of like, I think the situation too. We have to sort of figure out, like, in our own communities, how are we going to start doing that work? Well, I think that's what I would say what we should be doing moving forward.
Well said. And I think the specificity you're adding there is so critical. Like the common theme we've had in our conversations is just, who exactly is the Black community? How do we outline that and define it? How do we make that concrete? And how do we communicate that in a way that's digestible to the non-Black community? Mm-hmm. And one of the things I've struggled with rectifying is, you know, Mark said this in a conversation where if you kind of put your finger in the air, you can kind of get a sort of sense of what Blackness is like in general. Mm-hmm. Like Blackness in the Indo-Caribbean community, Blackness in the UK, Blackness in Canada, US, et cetera, and so on. So there's something universal to it that we can say is related to an inferiority to white supremacy. Mm-hmm. That we all have had to learn how to embody. But what I'm curious about is, how do we appreciate that globality and universality while making sure that our conversations are very specific? Like, because again, there isn't a Black community in Jamaica as there might be one in Trinidad.
Totally.
Like, it's very specific.
Yeah, even like I used to live in the UK as well. And even there, it's, you know, it's all very different. I think there is, so we have to figure out, what do we have in common, and how do we, or like, if we're going to talk about the Black community, what does the Black community have in common across all these different countries and cultures? But then what is the difference, right? Because like you said, like, being a Black person in Trinidad is going to be very different than perhaps being a Black person, you know, in America, who's like African American, who, you know, like it's, and I think those differences are so beautiful as well, right? Because I know a lot of my friends that I know in, let's say, Bushwick, for example, that are Trinidadian, they wouldn't necessarily call themselves African American.
Right.
They're like, no, I'm from Trinidad, I'm American. Like, you know, so those kind of things are really beautiful. But I really do think we have to do a lot of educating. Things get so lost, and these things are really complicated. We can't deny that, you know? And I don't want to, I'm not saying education in like an elitist way, not at all. But I think you can learn a lot just from talking to different people in your community as well. And things are really accessible these days. And I just think education is a huge, huge part of that. And I think I'm really moving towards that now as well, like anti-racism education as well, because there aren't a lot of tools out there for people. And I just think there's no way for us to move forward without that. We have to have that education. And then I will say the next generation, I think, is doing quite a good job of that. They are so, like, Gen Z is so good at recognizing those differences and highlighting what makes us different, but also what brings us together, those commonalities. And so I think we could probably learn a lot from them.
Yes.
Yeah, what you said about education is super important. I feel like I know what you mean when you say, you know, you don't want it to sound elitist, but education, I think, covers, it's almost like a blanket term, because education comes in so many different ways. Mm-hmm. It starts at home, and it starts with the conversations that you're having with your children. It starts how you're treating your neighbors, and it starts with the actions that parents can take. That's part of education outside of what you show up in school. But that's a whole other conversation, right? How school, you know, how are we introducing anti-racist theories and practices to young children, you know, to combat the things that they may have learned by someone who really their intentions are poor, and they're not showing up for their global community, and they're not being a good neighbor, you know.
But also, like, we're not doing that though, you know, like, we're learning the wrong stuff. Like, the history we're learning is very white, and it's very, like, even in Canada, I'm sure you can attest to that. We do like 2 units on Indigenous people, and it makes that look like we're all good. Meanwhile, there's Indigenous people in Canada that like don't have running water. Like, come on, let's just be honest. You know what I mean? Like, so we don't have honest education right now in the US or in Canada. Like, so that's why I'm so glad too that a lot of educators are bringing that to the masses in the form of social media, right? Like, for example, at the Model Alliance, there's two amazing professors that we work with. One, her name is Kimberly Jenkins, and the other, his name is Jonathan Square. They're both Black educators, and they teach specifically on like fashion and race and fashion and slavery. And that's so important, because whenever would you think in a fashion degree that you would learn about fashion and slavery, or that there would be some sort of curriculum around fashion and race, right? So it's changing slowly, thank God. But like you said, it has to really start when kids are young, you know?
Yeah.
That sense of community and everything you feel comfortable with is built and started when you're really young. So hopefully, you know, the whole landscape of education will be changing.
Nadia, I know I'm taking up space, so forgive me. So I do have another question, because we went back to fashion. And this just came full circle. So we were speaking about Drake's influence on hip hop.
Mm-hmm.
He kind of, I mean, some would say he's a bit of a sellout, and has gone pop, but he's created this massive, large brand that a lot of people of color, Black people, Toronto has used as a platform to elevate our own status and position in society.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about the modeling world. So I'm sure, and this will go without saying, that modeling companies are looking for people of color, like exotic women, so that they can feature them on their ads and put them forward so they can show their wokeness. But you, within your own individual morality, I'm sure, have to make decisions. You're like, I know I'm being tokenized here, and that's quite annoying. That's racist. But also, as I tokenize myself, I'm building status. I'm building prominence, place, and through that, I now have an amplified voice, as you do. So I'm wondering how you kind of hold those tensions within your space.
Yeah, I think, to me, it's exactly like you said. Whether I'm being tokenized or not, the visibility is there. And I think a lot of the general public and consumers are pretty smart. Like, they know when people are being tokenized. But the other thing I've noticed that people are taking further is they're now looking into like those companies and how those companies are built, right? Like, so you may be trying to cast a Black model or a brown model or whatever to show this diversity or whatever, but like, how many people on your board of directors is Black? How many people of color do you have that work for you? I can tell you, I've rarely ever been at a photo shoot, and I've been a model for 10 years. I've rarely ever been at a photo shoot where there has been a person of color in a decision-making role. Almost never. I'll be on set and there's like 20 people roughly on set. There may be one other person of color other than me. So that to me is like, that's just wrong from the get-go, right? Like, how are you trying to show diversity and demonstrate, you know, wokeness or whatever, but you don't even have anybody in the room that knows what that's like or knows what our experience is like. You know, I had a really bad experience with a makeup brand whose name I will not mention, but because the campaign is out. But you know, I went in and they were, you know, these two white people were discussing what they wanted to do with my hair, and there was a Black model there as well, another model of color, and they wanted to give me an afro, and I was like, like, what are you thinking? And the Black model was like, oh, I would love to do that, like, give me an afro, you know, because she has had her hair straightened quite a lot. And they were like, oh, I just think it would be like too obvious if we did it on her. I was like, this is why you cannot be making these decisions. Like, this is very dangerous. I will say, in the end, they asked me and I said, look, I think you're going to get in trouble for this, and I think this is the wrong mood. But it really just put me in a horrible mood for the rest of the day. You know, I was like, this is exactly how these companies get into these problems. And people are getting called out, whether it's Pepsi or H&M or whoever, and they're still doing it. And why? Because it's the same people making the decisions. They're not changing their hiring practices. They're not changing who the decision makers are. And so for me, it's been about beyond that sort of visibility. You know, like, if I get the tokenism and I get the visibility, that's great. But now I'm starting to look into, and so is everybody else, how is your company made up? Who's making the decisions in that company? Because all of that is being reflected in what we see in advertising at this point.
Do you think it hurts the community when someone's selected as a token and they don't use that opportunity to educate and to advocate for their community?
I think to a certain extent, yes. But again, at the same time, just because it is media, you know, if I see somebody that looks like me, that in and of itself is helpful, you know, but it's, again, it's about taking that extra step, which I really think that we are doing. And I just want to give you one fun anecdote about Drake, if that's okay.
Yes,
just because you brought him up and I wasn't going to, but for example, like, you know, my husband is Indian. He loves Drake, and I will never deny what Drake has done for Toronto. I think it's very, very important. But as an Indo-Caribbean, specifically as a Trinidadian person, there are things that very much irk me. For example, one day we were in the car driving and a Drake song came on, and it was, you know, had a Caribbean flair because, you know, he's from Toronto, so he can do that. Fine. And I was like getting kind of upset hearing it, you know, and my husband was like, okay, but that's a Toronto sound, babe. Like that's doing it. I was like, oh, is it? Is it a Toronto sound? I wonder why that is. I wonder if it's because my people came here, like Trinidadian people, Jamaican people, Guyanese people, you know, Asian people. Maybe it's because we came to Trinidad. I mean, sorry, maybe it's because we came to Canada and maybe that's where he got it from. I don't know. Like maybe a little credit would be nice. Like, you know, I was just like getting really upset about it, but I was like, it's the same thing as like Lily Singh doing that Vanity Fair video and saying that it's Toronto slang. I'm like, is it? Because that sounds kind of like Jamaican slang to me. Like, let's just like be honest about it. But because we're not having the conversations, we're sort of covering everything with these like unfair labels, you know? And so I just think that that's a huge thing that we need to change.
And Drake's father is African-American. I don't think he's Caribbean or in touch with any Caribbean roots whatsoever. So it's not like we're looking at a man whose, you know, father was bumping the tunes when he was cleaning up in the morning. Like, no, he didn't grow up in that life, unfortunately, you know, for
yeah. And I'm not like saying that I don't listen to him or anything. Like I do. I think the music is good. But like, again, it's like, where's that line? What's that fine line between when it's okay to sort of like say like, I really love this music and I've been so influenced by it, but when is it okay for you to create it and put your name on it? And, you know, I don't know, it's blurry, but we're going to have to figure it out together.
Can you shout out some experiences that you had with decision makers of color in your industry?
Oh, there really haven't been very many.
That speaks volumes, I think. It speaks volumes that, you know, you can call on a negative experience and we're so, you know, lacking in positive experiences from that. What would you tell, you know, some of the younger generation? I forget which letter. Is it Gen Z is younger than us?
Yeah.
You know, it shows my age. Women of color or people of color, men as well, that want to come up in your industry, in the fashion industry or in the literary industry.
Yeah, I think the number one thing is just to be unapologetic. We don't have to like is it Stefan or Steven?
It's Stefan, actually.
Oh, Stefan. Okay, so like Stefan was saying, it is our superpower, right? It's what makes us different, and we need to not be apologetic about that. We need to not downplay like what we get from these differences and what they bring to us. I think that's the number one thing, and I have to say, this generation is already doing that. I may be biased because I know a lot of activists in that space that are Gen Z activists, but I really believe they're already doing that. They don't take shit from anybody. And I think we just need to push that attitude out more. But again, it's happening, right? Like now we're realizing that something that started with police brutality is turning into like the whole media landscape changing. So it is all connected. There's no denying that. And we need to just keep calling it out. You know, when this situation happened with Jessica Mulroney, I said to my husband, I was like, watch her endorsements drop. Like, watch these TV shows drop her. It's going to happen. And it happened in one day. I didn't think it was going to happen in one day, but she lost everything in one day simply for mistreating a Black blogger. And like, we're not taking it anymore, right? Like, we're calling it out. And I think we need to continue calling it out.
Yeah.
Nadia, if it's okay, I have one question that I want to extend also to Mark. So both to you, Shivani and Mark. Mm-hmm. So one of the things you said just really connected with me about your experience hearing Drake being played in Toronto and how necessarily bothersome that could feel. But I don't know if both of you would agree, but in Drake playing Caribbean music within his reach and his power, he's also giving voice to Caribbean artists and attention to Caribbean music. And so what I really want to underscore and highlight here is this becomes this weird, ambiguous moral space of like, what do I actually stand for and what do I support and how does that map to my own values and ethics? But the question is, is the place of anti-racism or anti-Blackness a moral concept, or is it a practical one? Like literally, we don't have representation at the top. So morality aside, should we say we just need to push forward to get some sort of visibility? Or is it like, no, we should probably do this properly in a way that honors ethics, even at the level of Caribbean Blackness versus North American Blackness?
I mean, I always say this, and I don't know if I'm like just Gemini, but I think we should do both. And I think we can do both. And I think we are doing both. I think we're seeing it happen on every level. Obviously, like I said, as a Caribbean person, it irks me to a certain extent. However, like you said, he does do shows with Marshall and things like that. And I'm happy about that. You know, I want it. The difference for me is when you start to act like our culture is your culture, or when you start to brand yourself with it. That's what I have a problem with. And I can imagine, you know, a lot of Spanish speaking people being upset with him for doing that as well. You know, it's a little bit like, all right, like, you know what I mean? There's a lot of Spanish artists out there really trying to make it, and they can't, because there's all this like sort of, you know, red tape that they have to get around, but yet, you know, he can do it right away. So, and I'm not hating on him. I'm just saying there are things that need to be discussed in there. I don't know how you feel about that, Mark, but that's how I feel as a Caribbean person.
So I just think that he's audacious. You know, he's a little bit conceited, because like, but then again, that would just appear to somebody who's from the Caribbean, who is from that space, who's from that culture, and knows what the music sounds like. So to me, like, his attempt at a dancehall song sounds terrible. It sounds horrible. I don't like. So that's why I don't like it. But back to the matter of like giving Caribbean people or dancehall artists representation, I think there's another way to do it other than trying to sound like them. You could literally put them on more songs. You could put them in more of your videos or whatnot, you know.
Right.
So I think what he's doing is that he hears something, thinks it's cool, and he thinks he can do it as well, you know. And to people who are not from that culture, it might sound okay, but to people who are from the culture, it sounds actually horrible. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's my problem with him.
I think that absolutely begs the question, where is the line between appreciation and appropriation? Mm-hmm. Where are we comfortable to say that he appreciates the culture, so he's going to feature popcorn on a song, but is that line drawn where he's trying to speak in an accent and it's, you know?
I mean, it's exactly like the Lily Singh video, right? I was like, yeah, of course people are going to be upset about that. Are you kidding me? You're putting on a fake accent. Like, and then somebody asked me that exact question. She was like, well, what's the line between appropriation and appreciation? I was like, first of all, Google is a thing, so you can Google it. There's some really good resources out there. It's not my job to educate you. But secondly, like, she was like, oh, so like, is she allowed to wear cornrows? I was like, no. Like, are you really asking me that? Like, that's such a basic question. Are you serious? Like, people don't get jobs because their hair is in braids, and you're like, she can just do it for fun. Like, why, how is that a question? Like, I don't know, maybe that's elitist of me to think that, but I just think that doesn't, you know, it doesn't make sense. And to me, the line is like, to a certain extent, maybe from a fashion perspective, I think the line is quite clear. But when it comes with music, maybe it's a bit different, because that sort of a creative in a sound way is maybe a bit different, and I'm not an expert in that field, so maybe that's why it's more clear to me in fashion. But yeah, I just think, you know, at least people are asking the questions now.
Yeah, I think the difference even between how it appears in fashion and how it appears in music is very, very different points, because you know, you talked about headdresses at festivals or Halloween or wherever. That's bold appropriation, you know, and is that, you know, that line's a little bit, is it maybe more blurred when it comes to music, because music, as music evolves, the sound evolves based on the culture that a person is drawn to, right? So naturally, you know, where do we stop them, you know? And yeah, I think some of the examples that we like brought up, the cornrows, the like accents, the, you know, trying to make a dance hall song, be it Lily Singh or Drake, like, yeah, it's definitely something that I know a lot of education exists. It's just people feel, and I wonder why people feel so offended when they get accused of appropriation. Like, how do we encourage people to not take offense when we're calling them out on something that we, as the community that you are appropriating from, are telling you are appropriating it? You know, how do we?
I think how we can do that is by like canceling cancel culture. I think a lot of times people are so afraid because they're like, oh my God, if I admit this, then I'm going to get canceled. You know, that's very toxic. Cancel culture doesn't do anything. What is the point of us educating? Am I just going to educate people that already are abreast or like what I'm speaking about? Then that doesn't make sense. The point is to change people's minds. So if we could create a more open community, like a more open space where if you call somebody out, then they're like, oh, okay, wait, let me just backtrack and sort of see what was my intent there. Like what was, you know, and we could sort of have it be more of a discussion based thing as opposed to like attacking people. I think that would help with that. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I think psychological safety is such an integral part of transformation and evolution. You must first create a climate that people can grow in, and cancel culture stands directly in the way of that. But I also want to point out, because I think we've been speaking on it in so many ways, is that we have to confront our own hypocrisy. Like Lily Singh and Drake are people of color, and they're the appropriators in our story thus far. Like, how can we go out and suggest that there's a model way of being for non-Black people or non-colored people when we are the ones who are doing the same exact things in a more pervasive way because we feel entitled to it? Like, even the way both Lily and Drake speak about it, they're like, yeah, I'm from Toronto, that's fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, please.
I'm wondering if I'm wondering if thinking about it in terms of cultural appropriation is enough. You know, so I'm wondering if we could introduce the lens of self-awareness, especially. I'll speak to Drake's point. So as an artist, you know that it takes decades, you know, to perfect your art. It takes decades to become a good hip hop artist. So why would you not believe that it takes decades to become a good reggae artist as well? You know. Why do you think you could like hang around a few reggae artists and then go and make a reggae song and have it sound like something that's appealing and worth putting out there? So I think that in that case, it speaks to his lack of self-awareness in that space. So I'm wondering if self-awareness could be introduced as a model to deal with some of these things that are more or less harmful to Black artists.
Well, I will say in terms of self-awareness, I think one of the things that I think takes away from their self-awareness is the fact that they get validation from these artists. So like Lily is she very much receives a lot of validation from Marshall, from Kets, from whoever, right? She feels like she can do it because the people who are top in the space are telling her that she can, without realizing that like, okay, but you're a part of this like A-list community at this point, right? Like they're not going to call each other out. Like everybody wants to be all friendly because we're all high up there. We don't want to create any drama, right? And that's a problem with that community as well. So what? Like, you know what I mean? If you see somebody that's doing something wrong, or I don't know, maybe genuinely they don't see a problem with it. I don't know. Maybe they don't. But like, I think that really takes away from that self-awareness as well. You know, Marshall is there with Drake at the show. So, and maybe he's doing it for the same reason that I am okay with it sometimes. Maybe Marshall just wants the visibility too. And he's like, maybe that's something that has to go along with it, that I have to sacrifice. I don't know.
Yeah. I think it mirrors also some of the, you know, I can see a clear thread through to some of the conversations we were having about remedies for the justice system. Things like the North American approach to apply consequences, and you mentioned cancel culture. The North American instinct to, you know, beat the sin out of somebody once they've been caught committing a crime versus rehabilitating them to give them what they need and remedy what caused them to get to where they are. Often, you know, outlashes and poor behavior is a result of trauma. Often it's a result of circumstance and situation. And those are things that we have the tools, especially in this day and age, to really remedy. So I think it's just really interesting. And it's a great thing to see that this common thread of we need to eliminate this harsh punishment for horrible things and start to really speak to safe psychological spaces and how to rehabilitate people it's a very important conversation. And I love to see that it's a growing conversation.
Did you see that tweet where they were like, I love how everyone went from like this pandemic and learning to make banana bread to like, let's abolish it in 6 weeks. It's incredible.
Yeah. What a space to be in. Like we are truly in, you know, on page 117 of a history book right now, and this chapter is going to go on. So I just want to, yeah, so I want to kind of close in and be conscious of the time because we just passed the hour mark. So we'll start to kind of wrap up. I think it's the last thing, or I'll call it the last, but symbolically it's really at the start, is what are some of the next steps that we can take as, as a community in all these varied communities that you're a member of?
I think, yeah, being unapologetic is huge. Not canceling people is huge. Realizing your own hypocrisy, like Stefan?
Yes, you got it.
Like Stefan said, very important. No ego, just how can we work together and take onus on, the issues that we have and how we fix them. And I think honesty is a really big part of that. Like, we just need to be honest about these things, and really, and education, I think, would be the other part of that. I think one thing that makes me really happy is just seeing alone on Instagram, the amount of just like swipeable stories, swipeable like galleries that have such good information on them. Whether, sometimes whether it's something I agree with or not, I still think it's such a good way to have just really digestible information. And like I said, with our guidebook, it was about creating an entry point. This isn't the be all end all of like ending anti-Blackness in the Indo-Caribbean community, but my hope is that you use the resources that we suggest, and it's just an entry point into you figuring that out and helping, our community dig deeper into these issues. And I hope that this is, I know that what's going on now is going to be a huge step in the right direction. And once again, like, I feel, we have the Black community to thank for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Shivani, I want to thank you for your perspective, and I truly appreciate a lot of the stances that you've taken and kind of where you're speaking from and how you're advocating for the community. So I think our gratitude, as I'll speak on the behalf of Eternal Remedy, our gratitude is endless for the work that you do. Can you plug, and can you tell us where we can find you? How do we follow you, and how do we absorb your work?
So yeah, just Live Shiv Media is where most of the guidebook stuff, or most all the social justice stuff that I post. It's LIVESHIV Media. And then Live Shiv is just where you can find me on Instagram and Twitter, LIVESHIV, 2 V's if you're on TikTok, but I don't really use TikTok anymore. It's a whole different community on its own. But yeah, that's where you can find me. And I want to thank you guys as well for having these kind of conversations. I think it's really important. And for even like thinking that I was worthy of it is really special for me. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Your presence here was perfect. I think this was a great union that we had today. Steph, is there anything, any close off comments or thoughts from you?
No, again, just echoing the appreciation. I think I can speak on behalf of myself and say you've elevated and opened new insights for me in a way that I haven't found space to explore. And just bringing that into a more generalized, I guess, insight to draw from this, just how important it is to really take inventory of the psychological landscape that we're in right now. It's not merely us giving information, stats, and data on what's going on. It's like really know what sort of mental place brought us into this. Because an example that came even as you were speaking, Shivani, was, we in this movement, we're saying a lot about how Black lives are a consequence of structural and external factors. And then we're saying police brutality is individual responsibility. There's an irony in that, and we just have to make sure we're very aware of what is the foundational point through which our words are coming from, and then we can move forward and do really reasonable, meaningful action and change. So those are my final remarks. We'll be doing this again tomorrow at 7 p.m. Come hang out, and we have another one on Tuesday as well at 7 p.m. So the series is continuing. It's been super fire. Shivani only just encapsulated and made that all the more clear. And so, yeah, this has been fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys.
Awesome. If we're all good, then we will bid you a good Saturday and a good weekend, unless anybody had any questions, comments, thoughts. Just yay. Awesome. Shivani, thank you so much. Everybody who tuned in, thank you very, very much, and enjoy your weekend, guys.
Bye.
All right, bye.